That'd be good. Be handy. Did you say turn the phone on? Yeah. That's a good idea. Don't even know I brought it in. Would you please stand? Welcome to this ordinary meeting of Hunters Hill Council. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and the waters that surround us.
We thank you, Lord, for the honour of being called by our fellow citizens to this office of honour and trust. Give us grace diligently and honourably, free from private interest or prejudice, to discharge the duties entrusted to us to the common good and as in your sight, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Please have a seat. I see there are no apologies. Are there any declarations of interest, please, councillors? So we move to confirmation of the minutes. Councillor Miles, Councillor Williams. Any discussion, councillors? Councillor Collins.
Question. It's regarding council expenses. Question without notice from 28th of October.
Mr Mayor, the finance team are finalising that and will be in the bulletin on Friday.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
I'll put the motion. I'll put the up the recommendation. Those in favour, against, that's carried. Thank you. Councillor Sanson.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Given that we received some excellent legal advice about item 3.1 in the briefing today, could I move that we alter the agenda so item 4.1 precedes item 3.1?
Second for that. Councillor Cressler. All in favour? That's carried. Thank you. So, Councillor Collins?
Oh, just move it.
I think it's been moved and seconded.
I don't think that was moved. The
Sorry?
discussion whether to bring forward.
Bring forward?
Yes.
Okay.
And that was
you want to
carried.
move the
I'm not moving
4.1, the legal advice. Thank you. Seconder? Councillor Sanderson. Councillor Collins. We do have a
Oh, yeah.
Speaker, that was
we have a couple of things. We have a speaker, and I was going to invite the gentleman who wrote the legal advice to speak on it, also Jürg. So we could start with the legal advice first, or we start with the speaker.
We're on the legal advice. Speakers for item 3.1.
Yeah. So maybe
It's actually for both.
We're dealing with 4.1, are we?
4.1. So maybe the lawyer.
I think we might start with the legal advice first, and then we'll move to you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, councillors, and thank you for the opportunity of addressing council on the substance of the legal advice provided to council in connection with the notice of motion that's before council this evening. I've been asked to provide a brief summary of my legal advice to council, and in doing so wish to highlight a number of matters. Firstly, it is very clear in my discussions with council staff and also in previous discussions with councillors that this council is strongly committed to giving life to the guiding principles noted in Section 8A2E of the Local Government Act 1993, which provides that council decision making should be transparent and decision makers are to be accountable for decisions and omissions. I term that phrase, or coin that phrase, as the transparency principle, which underpins the decision-making of the Council. Now, the context for the notice of motion arises in the sense that the Local Government Act sets out a clear legislative framework within which information might be considered confidential, and where the disclosure of that information is required to be kept confidential. Section 10A, subsection 2 of the Local Government Act sets out a number of matters where it is appropriate indeed for the Council to retain the confidence of certain items and thereby preclude those items from being detailed in communications to the public by way of inclusion in the business paper. Specifically, matters such as personnel matters or the personal hardship of the ratepayer, confidential and commercial information are matters that are likely to invoke this type of exception. This, in a sense, is a limitation to the transparency principle. The notice of motion seeks to provide for a proactive release of government information. Now, that is certainly a matter that falls within the framework of the Government Information Public Access Act, and I might refer to that moving forward as the GIPPER Act, which advocates the proactive release of government information. The important thing, though, for Council to appreciate is that the nature of the disclosure that it seeks to make is something that should be made cognizant of the requirements of both the GIPPER Act as well as the Privacy Information Protection Principles set out in the Privacy and Information Privacy Act, and should be made in consideration of the provisions of the Local Government Act. Now, if there were to be a release of confidential information that falls outside of that framework, then it could certainly cause Council to be exposed to legal action being taken against it, either for breach of confidence or for the unlawful disclosure of personal information and circumstances where that disclosure occurs outside the legislative framework contemplated by the GIPPER Act and the PPIP Act. In that sense, I would suggest, and I have advised Council, that it is imperative that the release of any information should be undertaken in a way that is cognizant of the requirements of the GIPPER Act and the PPIP Act, such that Council applies the public interest test whenever it provides for the release of information that has previously been identified as confidential. The public interest test is set out in Section 13 of the GIPPER Act, and it requires Council to weigh up the public interest considerations in favour of disclosure against those public interest considerations against disclosure. And in doing that exercise, Council is then required to make a determination as to the release of that information. The GIPPER Act provides a very clear framework within which that decision-making process is required to occur, and to supplant that with a process that goes beyond it is both administratively and expensive for Council in the context of requiring legal advice on every occasion that such a release is contemplated as proposed in the notice of motion. The other thing that I would like to stress is that the GIPPER Act provides, as I said, for a very clear approach to the way in which confidential information might be released to the public, and it provides for a very considered approach that not only requires Council officers to undertake an assessment of that exercise, but it's also an assessment that is then subject to review either internally by the Privacy Commissioner or the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal. And in that sense, those decisions are reviewable and follow an appropriate procedure and course of action, which I would recommend to Council continue to implement in order to maintain its strong commitment to the transparency principles founded in Section 8A of the Local Government Act. Happy to take any questions if that's required.
Thank you. Are there any questions of Mr. Smith-Learmonth? Councillor Miles.
Under the GIPPER Act, and having made many GIPPER applications myself, you have to pay as a resident to apply for a GIPPER application to the tune of $20 or so per application. So I guess this motion seeks to, as you say, take a more proactive approach in releasing public interest information, and you think that there would be a very substantial, like not wanting to detract from our obligations to keep confidential information, confidential commercial in confidence outside of what we're releasing, you think that this would be an overly burdensome legal exercise?
Perhaps the best way to answer that question is to provide some additional information before I respond to the question. And the information that I draw your attention to is found in Section 7, subsection 3 of the GIPR Act. And if I may just repeat the words of that section of the Act verbatim, an agency must, at intervals of not more than 12 months, review its program for the release of government information under this section to identify the kinds of information held by the agency that should be in the public interest, be made publicly available, and that can be made publicly available without imposing unreasonable additional costs on the agency. So in the context of that section of the GIPR Act, you have in place already a program that provides for the proactive release of government information as considered appropriate without imposing additional burdens and costs on council. So in the sense of answering your question, yes, there is a fee involved in a formal access application, but not in an informal access application, which is provided for under the GIPR Act. The notice of motion in requiring the provision of legal advice in relation to the release of confidential information would impose a considerable cost to council in requiring a legal analysis of the disclosure of that information and its appropriateness in a way that goes above and beyond the process and the protocols already in place under the GIPR Act.
Councillor McLaughlin.
And just to follow on from that point, isn't it also true that you would have to contact all of the people involved in the confidential information disclosure as well and receive their...
Certainly, one of the processes that council staff are required to implement in respect of the release of confidential information involves seeking the input of a party that is concerned in the release of that information.
So I guess, again, to follow on, that would include people who have tendered...
Indeed, you would need to have their consent to the release of that information, and if that consent isn't forthcoming, then council would have to weigh up those representations when it is undertaking its assessment of whether or not it remains in the public interest to disclose that information, notwithstanding any objection that might have been received.
Councillors, any further questions of Mr Schmidt-Learman? Thank you very much. Please have a seat and stay with us a little bit longer if you'd like to.
My pleasure, thank you.
We do have a speaker. Thank you, Mr Young, for allowing us to go through the legal first. Mr Young.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Councillor.
Could I just raise a
3.1?
order? We need to vote on this.
Oh, I'm sorry, sorry, my mistake.
Yeah.
We'll get this out of the way. The legal advice we've taken, thank you. The recommendation of the report be received and noted. All in favour? Against? That's unanimous. Thank you. Thank you, Mr Young.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, councillors and staff for your time. Thank you, Councillor Collins, for the motion, and Councillor Miles and Councillor Williams for previously supporting this similar issue of transparency and releasing information to us. For councillors who weren't here at the time, there's a sad story about how 10 Carroll Street sale and heritage listing was handled by council in a way that the public had no idea what was going on and couldn't find out, and that really played out through the last term. Council, at the end of the term prior to last, took that property off Schedule 5 heritage listing, then, because apparently didn't have time to consider it under a report that's had since 2006, then came back, adopted the 2012 LEP without that property listed, not having decided against it, and sold it. And we, the public, tried to find out what's going on, how did this happen, what's happening, and we just met with brick walls. We couldn't get any information. The Mayor at the time told us that there was confidentiality applying to the deeds for the option deeds for disposal. We couldn't get those. We couldn't get information about how much it was sold for. We couldn't really get much at all. And then Councillor Williams and former Councillor Phil Jenkin, well known to everybody, met with the council back at that time, the Mayor, General Manager and some other staff, and said, this isn't, well, I believe, roughly paraphrasing, it's not a great way to operate. You should make this information available to us. There are agreed notes, which I'll give you a copy of, about that. And in Council's response to requesting, for example, that the put and call option deeds be released, Council said that they are subject to a confidentiality clause. This prevents the deeds and any information in respect of these deeds being disclosed without the prior consent of both parties. It's going back to this issue of needing consent. Safe Hunters Hill Municipality Coalition expressed a view to this response that this should never have been allowed to happen. The public interest demands that these documents should be disclosed to the community, as they should, and most of us would have expected that if you're selling our assets that we can find out about those sales after those deeds are executed. This wasn't during a period of negotiation. This wasn't when the buyer didn't yet know where we would end. This was after it was executed, after it was these deeds were binding on both Council and Mott, the buyer. We were told we still can't see them. We can't see what's happening to our assets, even though it's concluded. So Council was restricted in what it could do, in how it could deal with that property and what it could do with heritage listings, also subject to confidential briefings that we knew happened, but we didn't know what they said, and we still don't. And all of this was happening while we're just wondering, what was the point of coming here? You know, a whole bunch of us came here a bunch of times thinking that it made a difference, that we were talking to councillors who were, you know, interested or might have been able to do something, but these pre-briefings had already controlled what you could do. Thanks. I'll wrap up it quickly. So this principle, using the GIPA, we actually did GIPA. We also asked for something and got 6 archive boxes of stuff to sort through. It's not an uncommon legal tactic. You want something, discovery, here, discover so much, you'll never find what you want. So there's ways of doing this that is intentionally going to restrict access to information, to create confidentiality when we don't need to, and there's ways to work with the public that will restore trust and confidence. And I just ask that Council do what it can to rebuild trust and to make confidentiality not an excuse, a convenient excuse for hiding or for not letting us see what on earth's been going on. So I've got that, and also something that came out which is attached behind the notes of that meeting was a motion for
Mr.
Council.
Young, you've exhausted
Go on,
your 3
over.
minutes.
Sure.
Move to extend. Councillor Miles, Councillor Collins, all in favour? That's carried.
Thanks
Please
for
go
that.
ahead.
Yeah, it's just to explain. There's 3 of this, so I can put the space up there. So the motions from Councillor Bird. It's a pretty unusual stuff to get requests for that kind of transparency, but that's what happened.
Please stay with us.
Sure.
Thank you. Councillors, are there any questions of Mr. Young? Councillor Sanderson.
Thank you. Look, I'm very sympathetic to you know, being able to get information out of council. My concern is the motion that that we've got in front of us that Councillor Collins proposes is talking about confidential business papers. Now, in this instance, that may have, after a time, revealed information that you're after, but can, you know, in a lot of instances, how do you see this motion assisting your cause?
Thank you, Councillor. It's really, I guess, 3.1 and 4.1, and understanding that Councillors saw, I think, an intention to have information released, and Council's come back and said there's a framework bigger than this particular issue, and we sit within it. So I'm looking at the GIPA, I'm looking at the way that you contract and perform transactions to make it harder to get information afterwards or not. And really, are we actually so restricted from seeing so much information now that that sale is complete? What is left that could make this confidential now, if not that we've chosen to contract in a way that deliberately prevented visibility after the fact for longer than necessary? Why can't we see everything by now? The land's already sold, they own it. If not by choosing to contract into that confidentiality requirement.
Councillor Cresswell.
Sorry, can I just ask, because I might have missed Mr. Sentence, have you recently requested this information?
No, not recently.
Okay, so,
I'll do it.
because you're asking now,
Yeah, sure.
why isn't it available now? I'm just wondering, have you recently asked
sure.
for it?
And I guess it goes to the point that you ask for information, you try to get it at a point in time, and then it goes away, and we don't know when that comes off confidentiality. What's the event? What's the timeline? There's no register, there's no publicly visible, as far as I can tell, visible source to go and see this. And when we asked for information, it wasn't you can get a X.
And that was in
It was just
2015?
no. 2013, 14, 15, a bunch of times. Yeah.
Thank you.
Councillor McLaughlin.
I think we heard earlier from the legal advice that there is a mechanism whereby these things are reviewed under Section 7 of the Local Government Act, or should be every 12 months. So perhaps that's something
We
that
can get stuff.
yeah,
We'll have another go.
help with
We'll
that.
try.
So.
Yeah, but yeah, we'll have a go. Thank you. It's a good point. We should do it. And thanks for trying to promote transparency because we love it.
Thank you. Councillor Sanderson.
Mr Mayor, would it be in order or to move an alternative?
Thank you,
motion?
Mr.
no.
Young.
I don't think that would
Please,
be
Mr. Young. What was,
appropriate.
so was the
I'd
question?
I'd like to move the motion. The motion's
Yeah, I
here. I think that's the way to
It's
do it.
with Councillor Collins. Councillor Miles, seconded. Councillor Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thank you, Mr. Young, for bringing this to our attention. I think the intention of this motion is clear, and rebuilding trust is an important thing that council needs to do. Now, there are absolutely going to be aspects of this motion that need to be reworked, and I expect that we should do that on the floor. I think number one's very, very straightforward in that we build into our processes that future business papers become, will become public, and we can, any parties involved, we can tell them in 3 months' time or 6 months or 12 months this will become public, so we don't have to worry about whether or not we can, breaching confidentiality. There are going to be issues with certain motions. If they're, for instance, hiring of a general manager, I think there's aspects there of personnel matters that probably should be kept confidential. But when we're talking about sale of council assets, I mean, there's a no-brainer. At some point in time, that needs to be public. When we're talking about agreements that we make with external providers, specifically long agreements, which we've done recently, which we're not allowed to talk about, that should be made public at a certain point in time. And I'm quite open as to whether or not that's in 3 months or 6 months or a year or even in a week. As for number two, I've put after 5 years to have I certainly wouldn't want to think that everything from since the last fire when all the files were burnt is released at the same time, and it should be on request. So, if Mr. Young has a request about 10 Cal Street, then that should fall within that period of time. I wouldn't say automatically release everything in the past because I don't think that's very potentially workable. We'd have to go through every business paper for the last 50 years, but I think that what has been made confidential should be made public, so people, if they do have questions about it, they can say, well, actually, I would like to see that, because every resident has a right to know what we are doing behind closed doors. And there are things that we do need to do in committee of the whole away from the public. And we make decisions away from the public, but we need to be accountable for those decisions to the public at some point in time. Depending on what the matter is, we need to be accountable. At the moment, there is no mechanism. There is no mechanism where old papers are, whilst it might be allowable within the GIPA Act. I'm not sure if we have maybe a question to the General Manager. Do we actually do that as a policy every 12 months, release a bunch of stuff to the public, or?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Collins, at the moment we're uploading information to the website as an ongoing process, particularly because of our new website. We've recently appointed a governance officer and we'll be focusing a lot more around governance and delegations, policies and all those other practices. So in short, yes, we do. As we upgrade our website, we are uploading information, but there'll be other opportunities to strengthen that as we go forward.
But have we uploaded any confidential matters that were previously confidential?
The items, when they're dealt with council, the business paper and the minutes are published, and what is on the website is the decision that council made in relation to the confidential items. So the resolution of council is published. The content of the reports isn't published.
Okay. So we've got these and I've got a few of them here, confidential items from certain meetings. We don't have a whole lot of them. There might be 3 or 4 a year. So they're not all that frequent, but they are important things. And whilst the public will see the decision that is made, that we decide to do something, enter an agreement to sell something, the decision-making process that goes behind that, the public don't see what we see to make that decision. That's not transparent decision-making. So what this does is to give us an opportunity to take a step in the right direction. I am fully prepared to work with all councillors here tonight to come to some kind of an agreement that we're taking a step forward in the right direction. And if this is something that we have to work on over the next 6 months or whatever it is, to try and get us to a point where in the future all our confidential discussions and decisions are made public, and we have a way to deal with the decisions in the past. So, I mean, I think number 2 might be quite a very broad, quite a broad fishing exercise here, and so I'll be very brief here. But I think number one sets a good precedent, at the very least, to say in the future decisions are going to be made transparent, and then we can come back if we have to. If there are issues with that, we can deal with that. But I think ultimately we need to take a step in the right direction, and I'm fully willing to work with everybody to do that. To actually completely deny any progress is completely unacceptable to the community. And I will just say finally, I think on a matter like this, I think if anyone was to disagree with it, they should have the courage to get up and explain why, because this is something that the community are particularly interested in, and we need to be held accountable for this decision. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Councillor. Is there anybody wishing to speak against the motion? Councillor Sanderson.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. It's unfortunate that I have to speak against it. I think people will understand my commitment to opening the processes of this council up. As you recall, when I moved 5 amendments to our code of meeting practice, the one that wasn't successful was the one where I requested that our council pre-meeting briefings became public. I've also suggested that one of the best ways to deal with freedom of information is to put all information that is not confidential as possible on our website. This cuts down the process of dealing with freedom of information requests that would otherwise become unnecessary. We've had, however, legal advice tonight, and it cannot be ignored. So I think the important thing that we should do is commit strongly to openness of government. I do have an alternate motion that I believe the General Manager has a copy of, that I would like to move as an alternate motion, or perhaps I will do. Perhaps the briefer way to do it is to move it as an amendment to the existing motion. If you would like me to read that, I do have copies.
Could you distribute the copies and give us a moment to read through it first?
Maybe we could do this a bit earlier next time.
Right. Just give us a moment to read
Sure.
through it, please,
Okay.
Councillor. Have a seat. We'll read through it. All right, Councillor Sanderson.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Councillor Crassel has just pointed out one small typo in part 2 of the motion, which would be corrected by deleting the word of before government information. Look, as Councillor Collins has suggested, this is an incredibly important matter, and I think there is some potential for further work on this, but I think we need to have a starting point that's within legal bounds. We've just heard from our expert legal advisor that the motion that was originally drafted will bring about all sorts of legal problems, one of those being that legal advice will need is sought before items are, confidentiality is breached. It's an area I had a look at this morning. On top of all of the statutory problems, there is the issue of determining what in fact is confidential, and that's the reason why under the statutory provisions it's necessary to approach all of those who have some issue of confidentiality in it, because this is actually law that was made in Australia by the Honourable William Dean when he was a Justice of the High Court. It was a judgment that he wrote himself in Moorgate Tobacco and Philip Morris No. 2. It was the only judgment, although the Justice of the Court agreed with him. And one of the principles that he made in this, which is very clear, is that an obligation of conscience, most heads of equitable jurisdiction I'll start again. It lies, or the notion of confidential information lies in the notion that an obligation of conscience arising from the circumstances or through which the information was obtained. In other words, the obligation of confidence comes about through the way the information was conveyed or the understanding at the time it was conveyed. So a lot of the time you have difficulty in even determining whether the item was confidential. So I would be extremely reluctant for us to stray away from the excellent legal advice we've received tonight. It takes note of the provisions in the Act, and the motion that we have before us now is committing that this council will uphold, and I would expect it to uphold.
What's your point of order?
What motion do we have before us? Because
The one in front of you.
That hasn't been moved and hasn't been seconded, so it's not before us.
Hold on.
What hasn't been moved and hasn't been seconded.
Hold on.
So it's not before us,
Hold on
that's
a
the point of order.
Thanks very much. Do I have a seconder for the motion that's on the table that the council's speaking to?
As an amendment. or
An amendment.
The amendment. Do I have a seconder for the amendment?
For this amendment?
Yes.
I'll just second it to hear the...
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Sorry, I'm just a bit off my straight. Thanks to the break. I'm sorry, I thought that it was understood that it was an amendment. And
I thought you were speaking to it, and then after we're speaking, we find out we have a seconder after you've spoken to what it is. So
right.
We have a seconder. Go ahead.
Good, thank you, Mr Mayor. At the end of the day, the amendment to the motion is saying that the council recommits to the upholding of guiding principle noted in section 8A2E of the Local Government Act, which provides that council decisions should be made transparent and decision makers be accountable for decisions and omissions. The transparency principle. As a councillor, I would do all I could to hold us to that. If we find that that's not working, I'll be very happy to seek further amendment to this motion.
Councillor, you've exceeded your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody wishing to speak for the motion?
I think you just did.
Against the motion?
Against the amendment.
Against the
So
amendment.
we've had against, we've had the amendment to the motion. So we've got these for the amendment to the motion, against.
Yes.
Councillor Miles.
Just before I do, I will speak to it.
Can I just interrupt a second? To get clarity of what we're talking about here, is this amendment to replace the motion, or is it added on as point 4 and 5? 3 and 4.
Councillor Spencer. It's a replacement.
Thank you.
So it's amendment.
Probably should be put as an
You wish
alternate
to-
motion.
You wish to speak against the amendment.
I will speak against the amendment. The point that Councillor Collins and I are raising by putting this motion together, and I understand that it will probably need some working through. I see Councillor McLaughlin furiously making some notes as our legal head. But what we want to reiterate is that we want to take a proactive approach in dealing with matters of confidence. Now, of course, we want to make sure that the Privacy and Personal Protection Act and the GIPR Act are abided by at all times, and that is our obligation as custodians of this council to make sure that we are not going to breach our legal obligations. So matters that are commercial in confidence, personal information, absolutely should not be released at any point after 5 years or wherever. I do want to go back to the original motion, but my point being this amendment, which replaces the motion that we were attempting to put up, doesn't give effect to a proactive approach. To reinstate our commitment to an approach changes nothing, do nothing. To continue to proactively release, in the second point, it is the continuation of the same practices that we have now. What we're trying to say is let's be proactive. There are obviously issues that have been, concerns that have been raised from the community before, and I would argue, through processes that have happened more currently than that, that I as a councillor cannot convey to the community who are very interested in that said issue. I know what it's about. We know what it's about collectively because we were in that incompetence briefing. But people out there were affected by it. They don't have the full story. Now, I think that 70% of what was talked about in that transaction, let's call it, could be released to the public in one way or another, without figures, without names, without whatever. But we're not able to do that if we continue down the same approach that we're having. What I'm hearing tonight is that there is, in section 7, I'm assuming, the capacity potentially to, after 12 months, release some information that we deem appropriate as council to the public. And I think that would be a sensible way, perhaps, to look at doing this, and not wanting to add to the staff and the general manager's woes in terms of workload, but there's obviously some capacity there to do that. But to say that we're going to reinstate, that we are guided by the same principles as are in the Act, of course we are. To say that we want to continue to proactively release government information means that we're saying that we're doing it as well as we can now, which I don't agree with. I don't think that we're releasing confidential information as well as we should be. There are situations in the past where I, as a councillor, had a hard time. For example, getting a hold of the heritage report that potentially listed 10 Cow Street. Now, if I, as a councillor, can't get that piece of information, what hope in hell does the community have in getting it? So I would say that to reinstate that what we're doing now is best practice when there are issues in the community, coming from the community, and issues that have been occurring very recently. And I know this sounds pretty cryptic because, again, we can't release certain information, but there are things that we can probably do better as a council, and I don't think that this motion, which is reinstating what we're doing now, is the way to do it.
Thank you, councillor. Anybody wishing to speak for the amendment? Councillor Williams.
Yes, Mr Mayor. I'm a strong advocate for transparency in local government in this council, and as Mr Young pointed out, I've taken on the community's challenges to make sure that wherever possible information is available. I don't really understand from the debate today, from the discussion today, what the intent of the original motion was. To me, I believe transparency is about providing information to the community at the time that council's making those decisions. I don't see how we can make confidential information available to the community in terms of what the legal advice we've been given and the structure and framework of which we work in. I'm unsure as to what, I agree the previous situations weren't satisfactory, but I think we've come a long way in the last 2 years in making information available to the community through our new general manager, through our new communications process. I'm not sure what issues we've held back from the community. I'm strongly keen to make sure that information is available to the community that's not confidential. And I've said time and time again in this council chamber that we should make our briefings that aren't confidential publicly available. And I'd go even further to suggest that the community should be able to sit in on those briefings where they're not confidential. So I'm not quite sure what this motion is trying to achieve. Currently we have practices that do allow us to provide information to the community on what we're doing and where we're going. Some of the briefings should be made available to the community, but that doesn't fall within this gamut here. This is about confidential information. And I think we get into a minefield if we do start dealing with individual confidential issues requiring individual legal advice. I think Mr Young's situation can be coped with now. Council can reconsider whether or not that information can be made available. And back in those days, the information, some information was, the contracts and whatever were eventually made available, but there's a lot of, what do you call it? Redacted stuff in the documentation. So there are ways of doing it, but I don't think this motion really takes us forward. It actually just provides complication. I think we need to work where there are issues to resolve them within the framework that we have at the moment, which is our obligation legally and also within the Acts and our need to abide by the transparency principle. So my way of thinking is that the motion that was put by Councillor Collins and Miles is premature. I think if we're going to look at making confidential information more available, we need to sit down and have a close look at what are those issues in confidential that don't relate to staff, don't relate to contractual information, and don't relate to personal information that should be made available that's not being made available now. I can't recall anything in that outside of those 3 pillars that we're not making available. The processes are there.
Shelters.
Bus shelters, that's a contractual, commercial issue. Yeah.
Councillor, you...
I have concluded, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody wishing to speak against the amendment? Who has... have you spoken against the amendment already?
No, I haven't spoken against the amendment. May I?
Please go ahead.
Well, look, I appreciate the work that our resident law student has put into this, but the actual effect of what...
Was that intended to be a derogatory term?
No, he's a law student.
No, I've got 2 degrees law.
Yeah. Isn't
So,
that a law student?
Please.
Have you got law degrees?
Please, Councillor. Let's not turn this into a farce.
Okay. Anyway, both of these two points do nothing. Restating our commitment. By the way, stating that we are transparent does not make us transparent. If only it were that easy, but it doesn't. So, part 1 of the motion to restate our commitment is absolutely nothing. It does nothing. It means nothing. It's just saying we're transparent. So it's a waste of time. Number two, continue to proactively release government information. We are not doing that. We are not doing it. We have provision to do that under the GIPA Act, as we've been told tonight. Every 12 months it should be reviewed and put stuff up. We haven't been doing it. So to continue to proactively release, which we have not been proactively releasing, is disingenuous. We can't say that we're going to continue to proactively release when we haven't actually released anything.
Are you sure about that?
Well,
I'll put that to the gentleman again.
Sorry, through you, Mr. Mayor, to clarify, when we talk about releasing information, not talking about the detail of the confidential report, but in terms of information we have, we're making that increasingly available on the website. And as was mentioned, there are avenues through GIPA, which people do use to obtain information that's of interest to them and that they're seeking. So those avenues are there and they are used. And in terms of proactively releasing information, we do put as much as we can on the website, and as I've said before, we're going to increase that. As far as the confidential items, when council makes a decision, that decision is published as the decision of council. But not the contents of the report. And I believe our legal advisor has explained the reasons why we don't do that, and some of the difficulties administratively and legally that will make it quite difficult. And I think at the briefing, the legal advisor also mentioned that where matters are confidential and they deal with an individual, that there's, I think, a 30-year time limit after that person has passed away before that information can be released. So there are certain complexities around that. Sorry, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
so the business papers itself, our decision making, what we base our decisions on, they're not being released. We are putting bits of information out there over time, but we are not putting the substantial amount of the business paper or the so people can understand why we made decisions and what was the reasoning behind that. Now, as for Councillor Williams's comments, if the intent of this motion that I put forward is not obvious, I really don't know how more plainly I could put it. It is to put us in a proactive position of being more transparent. As I've said, I'm willing to work to amend and well, actually, I'll come back to that in the right of reply, but subject to legal advice, it doesn't mean we have to have legal advice on everything. If something contains something, if it's a rates waiver or something for an individual, of course, confidential for 30 years. We're bound by that. Council will know that, so we don't have to get legal advice on everything. And yes, it will be onerous. There will be more onerous legal and advice we will have to get to release some information. That is the price we pay to be transparent. I mean, the least onerous way for us to do that is to do everything behind closed doors, and no one ever has to, have any say or see what goes on. That would be very non-onerous. Being transparent is onerous. We are going to incur costs to deal with that, but I think it's a cost that we need to be willing to wear. This is not premature. This is not premature at all. Mr. Young has been seeking this information for many, many years. This is not premature. So I would encourage councillors to work with the motion I've got here. Make it something that you can work with. And I'm absolutely willing to discuss that. Let's just get rid of this one because it means nothing, and it basically says to the community, we're not interested. We're not doing anything proactive. And let's work the original motion, see if we can make it. We can come to take a step forward today, rather than one backwards or to the side.
Right, thank you. Just a reminder, we're dealing with the amendment, not the motion at this stage.
Correct. Yes.
So is there anybody else wishing to speak for the amendment? Against the amendment? Councillor McLaughlin?
For the amendment, and I'm looking at ways of trying to incorporate some things into, and I haven't really come up with any, but the point one of the original motion talks about making future confidential business papers publicly available once substantive matters has been decided subject to legal advice. I mean, is it as simple as putting making future confidential business papers publicly available in accordance with existing legislation? You know, we've got Section 7, which is of the Local Government Act, which is covering the consideration of the release of material after 12 months. We've got the GIPR Act, which is available to all residents to use whenever they need to. And I'm just wondering if that's perhaps something that might be worth considering.
Absolutely.
Because at the moment I can't support that original motion, and I have to support this one because the original motion is way too broad and covers confidential matters. That's right.
Please go ahead,
Well,
Councillor McLaughlin.
yeah, I'm just trying to work out
Please
how to
don't get distracted.
So I'm supporting the amendment, but I would also like to perhaps put in as point 1 my suggested amendment.
Okay, so what are the
Go back to the original.
Councillor Collins, please don't coach the witness.
I'm not sure how it works, but
This is going to get very complex. Very
you
Councillor
did
Collins,
say you wanted to work
Councillor
through the
Collins.
motion.
Councillor McLaughlin, what would you like? What are your suggestions?
I'm supporting the amendment, but I'm suggesting that point 1 becomes that council of the
Councillor
amendment,
Crassoy, could you just let Councillor McLaughlin
that
find her words,
council
please?
council consider or make future confidential business papers publicly available in accordance with existing legislation. I would like to go into more detail about that legislation, but I think that might cover what we might.
Right, so let's try and capture that. And if you could look at the screen and see if we've captured your words correctly, Councillor McLaughlin.
Now, perhaps that council consider future confidential business papers becoming publicly available.
Consider
No, that's not a good word.
where you were before.
Councillor Collins, can you just let Councillor McLaughlin have a shot at it?
Request that, I mean,
Could
so
you
we
just
can
allow
discuss
her
this all?
to find the words, please?
In accordance with the applicable legislation relating to the release of confidential information. And this is where something like that, you know, again, it'd be really good to get some of our legal advisors.
Does that capture your thoughts?
It has to be accepted by the.
So, are you moving this amendment, or are you asking Councillor Sanderson to consider this change?
Well, it's strictly an amendment to an amendment.
Unless you incorporate it in your amendment.
Look, I would have to be prepared to, but I see a problem with it. It's only referring to legislation. Common law and equity still comes into it.
So you don't accept that?
Not in its current form.
Applicable law?
So Councillor Mulligan, do you wish to proceed with this as an amendment to the amendment?
Mr Mayor,
Councillor Williams.
Mr Mayor, considering the discussion around the table and the need or perceived need to workshop this thing through. Could I suggest we move into open council for a brief period to enable a more full discussion so we can get to a resolution of it?
Move Councillor Williams, seconded Councillor Miles. Everybody in favour? All right, very good. Moved into open council.
The council since the old days.
Oh, I recall it from many years ago. It's very useful
Well,
in
it's
getting
because we
out.
don't have
Sorry?
business paper, we don't have telephone questions. Are we allowed to seek some?
We can. We can, but
Yeah, just say.
The intent of open council is to dispense with formal procedure and report.
But it would effectively
Mr.
does
Schmidt,
say-
will you advise and help us, please?
Which is why we just need someone to speak to.
Councillors, so Councillor Williams, Councillor Cresswell, would you come forward? So we're dealing with your issue at the moment. So do you want to ask a question about that?
Does that work for you? That's right. The applicable legal framework.
That's what I said.
And then you can incorporate that as item 1 in your amendment, and you can have words to that effect to encourage the proactive release of that information, subject to the review. Exactly. You're already doing that review. You're required to do that review. All you're going to do is endorse that review taking place as part of your proactive release of confidential business papers, subject to the applicable legal framework.
So you had a concern with that, though?
No, the applicable legal framework,
Works.
so what I was concerned about was that Justin suggested amendment, just said legislation, but it has to include law and equity.
Got to get it right.
So if you do it within the applicable legal framework, it captures it.
Okay, and that covers off the idea of the burdensome on council too.
That's exactly
Because they have
right.
to do it anyway under
You're
the law.
already-
So
yeah.
the motion means, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Okay, no,
If we resolve this,
Decide
then
on
I'll
what we
accept
can
that
release
assessment.
and what we shouldn't release. We can get more
Yep.
information. Whereas Russell's is completely different. That's something that we need to be doing.
Yes.
We just need to.
So does anybody need any more assistance from?
Well, how do we deal with the procedure? Do I just accept
An
that
amendment
as
to
amendment to the
amendment.
amendment?
You can adopt, you can
You just
incorporate.
adopt
the
it into
amendment.
I can incorporate that at
I think that's the way we do it.
Councillor Bogoff suggested.
Ben, you got any questions?
Yeah, no, where is the final, can I see where it
it
is?
doesn't need to be there because
No.
we've just taken out, we're going to take out.
No, not the
future.
original one. Yeah, but where's the current one?
Oh, sorry.
I just want to,
The amendment, the amendment?
Yes.
I think it is.
That should be.
It's-
Want to just
Yeah, that one, the bottom part, the council council, instead of future
jump
council.
on the computer and fix that.
No, I don't.
So shouldn't, why don't we just, instead of consider should be made? Right, and in accordance with the legislation.
Can we remove, are we happy with removing consider?
Sorry. Legal framework.
Let's work with Justin first, to get hers done, and then we'll go back to something.
Future.
And consider, or
Consider confidential. Consider
can
confidential.
we remove consider? So put in.
You could say proactively release,
Oh,
Proactively release.
proactively release future confidential business papers.
Council proactive
Confidential business plans, yeah, everyone knows
We don't need to say future.
No, you can just say confidential business
In
papers,
accordance with,
the applicable legal framework.
Well, let's try
And
that.
consider is gone,
Let's try that. Let's see what we can do.
proactively, yeah.
consider it's gone.
We haven't included anything.
So that council,
Okay, very good.
proactively release,
Oh,
in accordance.
Move back in the council process.
All right, move back out of committee. Councillor Williams, Councillor Crassoy. Councillors We're resuming now, and we're with Councillor McLaughlin on the first point.
So this is an amendment to the amendment that I think is hopefully addition to the amendment, which I hope will be accepted by the mover of the amendment, that Hunters Hill Council proactively release confidential business papers becoming public. Confidential business papers in accordance with the applicable legal framework relating to the release of confidential information. And that point 2 becomes point 2, and point 3 is point 3. And I think that covers off both points in the original motion. And I don't think I need to say anything other than I think it's a win for transparency.
Good job.
Okay, so the question we have with us at the moment is, if I might refer back to our legal counsel, do you feel that, is that at odds with the advice you've given us? Not advice. Councillor, thank you very much. Councillor Sanderson, you have to accept that amendment to your amendment and incorporate that in your amended motion. All right. Any further discussion required, councillors?
Oh, do I get right of reply?
You do?
Well, no, it'd be right to reply on the amendment.
Oh, we're doing the amendment first. Yeah.
Any further discussion?
Right to reply.
Right of reply?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Yeah, look, I thank Councillor McLaughlin for her suggestion. I think it's clarified things quite well at the start of going into open session. My concern about the original motion was that simply the wording that future confidential business papers or being made publicly available is effectively advocating a breach of the equitable doctrine of confidentiality, if not other things within the Act. So that's been clarified. As I said earlier, I'm totally for openness of the process. I'm pleased that the amendments I've suggested remain at points 2 and 3, as well as one which relates to business papers. I think 2 and 3 relate more broadly than just business papers. So I think
Councillor Miles, this is not the time to seek legal advice. Please listen.
I would reiterate. I think that as we have it now, is a win for all. That things will be more open and transparent, and those in the gallery, if I could say, if there are problems with obtaining future information, please speak to councillors, including myself.
All right, I'll put the amendment. Those in favour? Against? That's carried. Any further discussion?
I will just briefly say that I'm very pleased with the result here tonight. I think that having the having the right of reply. Is that
right of reply on the original motion.
No, because the amendment has
Become
now
a motion.
becomes a motion, and now I have right of reply on the original motion.
The
So I'm moving
amendment
motion.
became the motion. The motion
I did?
was put by Ben.
So
You don't know the process.
So we've dealt with the amendment.
So now
Which
amended.
now becomes the motion, which is.
I'll put the motion.
No.
Those in
No,
favour?
motion.
Against? So, but he has right of reply to the original
It's
motion.
Councillor Sanderson's motion now, Mr.
No,
which one?
no, because it was not dealt with as an amendment. It was an amendment, not an alternative motion.
Yes,
That's
I
right,
didn't
it's an
incorporate
It was
into
an
the
amendment,
motion.
which it now becomes the motion, which was.
He's quite right. He's quite right. He has right of reply because it's an amendment to the original motion, and right of reply goes back to the original move of the motion. Sorry, but it does.
It's in the code of meeting practice.
But I'd be happy to take advice from General Manager. Is that correct?
I'm only going to be 30 seconds, Mr. Mayor. If we
General
maybe
Manager says
perhaps
yes.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. This has been a very strange way to get to the process by moving, bringing our motion over to this. I thank you, Councillor McLaughlin, for. I like the way that it's put at number 1, combining the two ideas. At the end of the day, what's going to happen now is the council has a proactive approach to releasing information, and I would recommend, Mr. Young, if you have anything you want to obtain, to put in a request tomorrow, because this comes into effect today. So this council is now open and transparent, and it's been a good Okay.
All right, so
Always was.
the amendment becomes a motion, is that correct? And so we need to vote on that, is that correct? So I'll put the amended motion. Those in favour, against, that's unanimous, thank you. 4.2, implementation of legislation to manage boat trailer parking. Moved Councillor Williams, seconded Councillor Sanderson. Councillor Williams.
Yes, Mr Mayor. This now deals with what is an ongoing issue within the municipality where boats are left in locations that are not associated with the ownership, and they cause over a long period of time, in some cases, inconvenience and loss of parking opportunities for residents within the area. I think it's timely that we take this action, which is action which many other councils have already adopted, to be able to deal with inappropriately located trailers. And there's in the policy there's a very good diagram on page 9 that shows exactly what the intent of this is. And I think it will resolve unhappiness and potentially conflict within our community where people inappropriately leave for lengthy periods of time boat trailers.
Thank you, Councillor. Anybody wishing to speak against the recommendation there? For the recommendation, Councillor Miles.
Mr Mayor, this is long overdue. I think that this has been an ongoing issue since I first got on the council in 2012. There are a large number of out-of-area trailers that get parked in residential streets in Hunters Hill. They're usually near the water. Obviously, a hotspot is up at Park Road. There's another one at Joubert Street North. And you know, sometimes you have 4 and 5 trailers parked in a row, and there's people that are not from Hunters Hill that leave them there for a very long time, and obviously they impose restriction in parking to the residents. This is an issue I know around many sort of harbourside councils particularly, and they're focused around moorings and places where there's access to the water. So this is a very good policy. It's not dissimilar to policies adopted in other councils like Canada Bay, Lane Cove, and I think it's going to be welcomed by a lot of people in the community who have been hammering me, I can say, for about 8 years on this issue.
Yes, and me too, Councillor. Do we need any further discussion on this, councillors? Councillor Sanderson?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'd just like to add the areas that are affected that Councillor Miles has already suggested, and that is around the Woolwich Marina area, which is quite impacted, and certainly there's been a lot of discussion at the former Public Transport and Traffic Advisory Committee about this matter. Like Councillor Miles, I wish it had happened a bit sooner, and I think we've been at a bit of a disadvantage in that time, as much as it has meant that people have taken advantage of the fact that we haven't had this provision where surrounding councils are. So in a lot of ways we're advertising ourselves for this kind of behaviour. I'll be very pleased when we get through the consultation process and that this provision, or that this motion, which undoubtedly will become resolution of council, is put into effect. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Any further discussion, councillors? I'll put the recommendation. Those in favour, against, that's unanimous. Thank you. 4.3, quarterly budget review as at September 2019. Councillor Collins and Councillor Crassler. Councillor Collins?
Yeah, I've got a question about the $1 million upfront payment for the bus shelters. I noticed that there is a part of the bus shelter contract. Council is responsible for $380,000 of works associated with the new shelters. Can we get some? What is that?
Yeah, Mr Mayor, the works under the contract, council's obligated to do some works, capital works in relation to the lead up to where the bus shelters are constructed. So footpath paving works, etc. So that's been brought in the budget as a capital item.
And it's just footpaths, is it?
I might just further. Mr. Councillor.
Mr. Mayor, it is generally footpath and curb and gutter works.
Okay. Okay. All right, that's a good thing.
Councillors, any further discussion on this? It's an important issue. Any further questions? To receive and note. All in favour? That's carried. Thank you very much. Uh, 4.4, Hunters Hill Lane Cove Parramatta Ride Bush Fire Risk Management Committee, Bush Fire Risk Management Plan, a 5-year plan. Councillor Williams, seconded Councillor Miles. Are you appointing to Councillor Crasso?
I'm seconding Councillor Crasso.
All right, well, I missed it. So Councillor Crasso moved, seconded. Councillor Williams? All right. Comes to Councillor Miles.
Just in relation to this, I just noticed and it doesn't really give effect to the report or anything because that will be consistent across several councils, but the committee that was obviously the steering committee that ran this report, we had a council officer attend, but I noticed that the Mayor of Lane Cove is the chair. So what is this a functionary committee for the bushfire to come up with this report, or is it a council committee? I'm not quite.
I'll defer that to the General Manager.
Through Mr. Mayor, I'll need to take that on notice in terms of how the committee was constituted. But the committee does have representatives from different councils, and I'll need to look into how they've been sourced. Sorry.
We do that as a question at the end. Thank you. So, Councillor Crasso, you moved it to Councillor Crasso.
Thank you, Mr.
Even though I didn't see you.
Thank you. I'll be brief because it's a really comprehensive report and quite a thorough read. I noticed that Hunters Hill does have a few areas listed in there as high, medium and low risk, and that we have education and mitigation works advised in the plan. And all that I would add in comment, though it's going for community consultation, I know, but all that I will add in comment is that I have had quite a few residents contact me who live on the edges of these bushland areas, and they would really like to interact more with council on how they, as homeowners, can do a better job of keeping their deep properties and the bush behind them bushfire safe and ready in these seasons. So I'm sure that when the community consultation comes back, we might have something in the report that speaks to that. But thank you.
Councillors, any further discussion required on this? Councillor Williams?
Yes, Mr. Mayor. A couple of questions. Well, just one minor typo. In the actual document, they refer to Hunters Hill as being a shire. We're probably not at that scale.
Or borough.
No, we used to be a borough.
What page is that?
Oh, it's in the introduction to the actual page 31. It's just a minor thing, but it's a legal document, so they probably need to get it right. More importantly, on page 44, they refer to plan of management. Is that referring to the plan of management, for example, the Boronia Park plan of management? Because if that's the case, there needs to be some cross-referencing and some acknowledgement in our plan of management for Boronia Park, the existence and the relevance of this policy.
So you're looking at point 1, 2, 3, 4, point 5, is it? Fire management plans or plans of management? Page 44.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get there. Yeah, it's the fire management plans or plans of management. I'm confused as to what that really relates to, and I think we need to be clear on what they're referring to, whether they're plans of management for our reserves or whether they're actually fire plans of management.
Okay, take that on notice and clarify that. Thank you. Any further discussion?
I think that it's important that we engage with our Bush Care Advisory Committee in relation to this because as it refers in the document that bush management does have a significant impact in terms of reducing fire hazard by removing weeds and bush rehabilitation. So on that side, I'd like to see this document brought to that group's attention during the consultation process and get their direct feedback in regard to that.
Thank you, good suggestion.
One thing in relation to the aims and objectives of the report, or the, what's it called, the plan, management plan, is that it doesn't make any reference to the benefit of fire within bush. And I know I say that with all seriousness, considering the circumstances that the state is faced with bushfire. But in terms of our circumstance, where our bush is limited in size and quite isolated, fire is a very important component in reducing weeds and also regenerating bushland. It's a natural part of our bush. So there's no real emphasis here on hazard reduction and its relationship to bush regeneration. So it's just an observation, but because this is within a state framework, they don't seem to have considered that. But I think from a bush care point of view, that is an important element that is overlooked here, and maybe it should be included in, well, not included, but I think with consultation with our Bush Care Advisory Committee, we could work our way through those issues. So I think it's a very solid report. It's a report that allows us to understand the risks of our bush. I can recall back in the 90s, a major bushfire that swept down through the Lane Cove National Park, and it had the potential to find its way right through Buffalo Creek Reserve, along the foreshore, and even into Boronia Park. And the ferocity of that fire was something that could have caused damage. So I think it's very timely, very important that we understand our risks and that we work to deal with those. And I do urge that we bring the Bush Care Advisory Committee into that, because they play an important role in our circumstance.
Thank you, good suggestion. Any further discussion required? Councillor Crossoy, do you need? Councillor Collins has left the room. Could I take that out? And I'll put the motion. Those in favour? Against, that's unanimous. 4.5, draft purchasing and tendering policy. Councillor Crossoy, seconded Councillor Miles. Councillor Crossoy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would just like to read out for the benefit of anyone who's still watching and with their cup of tea. This is a really good policy, and I know it's actually just basically being reviewed and updated for the amendments to the Act. But I'd like to read this line out because I think it's really important for people to understand how this guides us. It provides clear guiding principles for the procurement of materials, equipment and services through quotations and tendering to assist in ensuring the best value for money, cost effectiveness, meeting the needs of the community, good management practices, transparency, probity, and the social and environmental aspects of sustainable practice. There's a lot of words in there, but it basically falls to that quadruple bottom line, the golden phrase that everyone likes to talk about these days. The other thing it does is it follows the guiding principles of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and I think that in every decision we make, they should guide us for good outcomes for equity in every way. So I commend the council officers who updated the report for us, and I'm really proud and pleased that they guide us.
Thank you, Councillor. Any further discussion required? Councillor Williams.
Yes, Mr. Mayor. I support Councillor Crassoy's comments. Just a couple of points, if I may. There's no reference or acknowledgement of supporting local local entities in terms of the procurement process. But more importantly, reflecting on Councillor Crasaw's comment about sustainability, at the recent local government conference there was a lot of discussion and emphasis on local government engaging with procurement processes that allow the circular economy, or the whatever it's called, circular economy, where you're recycling materials and actually making use of them as a product, be supported by local government, because we can create a market for a lot of the things councils are trying to initiate. For example, the Central Coast, they're crushing an enormous amount of glass into a fine sand and using it for a range of substitute sand processes. And that glass is being put to a very good reuse. So I'm just wondering whether there's an opportunity to put within the policy a acknowledgement or a recognition that we need to give consideration to engaging with the circular economy and, wherever possible, making use of products that are coming out of the recycling industry. I know we do in quite a few things in terms of reuse of plastic as a substitute for wood, that sort of thing, but there doesn't seem to be any real guidance or emphasis within the document that picks up on that important point, Councillor Crashaw.
Would you like to have that question addressed now, or will you do it as a question without answer?
I think, Mr Mayor, it's just an observation in the statement, and I think the General Manager can consider whether that's something that she wishes to
Thank you, Councillor.
expand on in the document.
Anybody wishing to speak against? Or can I put the motion? I'll put the motion. Those in favour, against, that's unanimous. Thank you. We go to 4.6, Enterprise Risk and Business Continuity Management. Councillor McLaughlin, seconded Councillor Sanderson. Councillor McLaughlin, would you like to speak to this?
I don't have anything in particular to say on it.
Very good. Anybody wishing to speak against? Who wishes to speak for? I'll put the motion. Those in favour, against, that's carried. Thank you, councillors. We move to 4.7, Report on Legal Matters November 19. Councillor McLaughlin, seconded Councillor Crassoy. Councillor McLaughlin.
I don't have any questions in relation to the report.
Anybody have any queries on the Councillor Williams?
Yes, Mr Mayor. Just an orientation thing. Is 27 Nelson Parade adjacent to the reserve? Is that the issue?
Can you show me which one you're looking at
it's
again?
the first one on page 106.
Cole.
It says unauthorised
27
works.
Nelson Parade.
Is that...
through you, Mayor, it's not near adjoining a reserve.
Okay, that's all I need to know. Thank you. I can orientate myself.
It's the opposite end of the
It's
street.
on the waterfront.
Yeah. On page 107, High Street, which is 198646, there's a GIPA application there outstanding from August. I was just wondering whether or not that is going to be dealt with. And there's legal representations being considered, but there's no comment as to what those...
Sorry, for the General Manager. Just for a moment.
This one through Mr Mayor, will come back by the bulletin. Councillor Williams.
Sorry?
We'll come back with an answer via the bulletin.
Oh, okay. Yep, I've got an answer to that one, and... Yep, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Any further discussion? Right, a reply. I'll put the motion. Those in favour, against, that's unanimous. We'll just check again. Sorry, I was a bit quick. Everybody in agreement? Thank you. There's a suggestion that we move some items as a block. Could I ask you to consider that, councillors? Could you have a look at your papers? 4.8, 4.9. 4.10, 4.11, 4.12, 4.13, 4.14, 4.15, 4.16,
Question on it.
okay, 4.17,
Oh, sorry, it's on that one.
1.17, okay. I'll just read through them again and make sure we've got it right. So it would mean that we will move 4.8, delegation to Mayor and General Manager, 4.10, councillor briefing 23rd September, 4.11, councillor briefing 28 October, 4.12, councillor briefing 18 November, 4.13, councillor briefing 25 November, 4.14, meeting of access and inclusion, 4.15, minutes of access and inclusion, and 4.16, minutes of public art committee. Councillor Williams.
10 through to 13, I want to make a statement. I can do it in a block.
Is it the same statement?
Yes.
10 through to 13, okay. Right, councillors, could...
Sorry, Mr. I have a query about 4.16 as well, but it's probably minor.
Okay.
Can I make a suggestion? If Councillor Williams was to move them as a block, he'd be able to make his statement in a block? Does that save us a bit of time?
Thanks for the suggestion.
No?
Let's work through them. 4.18, have I a mover and a seconder? Councillors Crasso, Councillor Williams, all in favour? That's carried. 4.9, move Councillor Crasso, seconded Councillor Sanderson.
That's one I'd
Oh,
like to
sorry.
Make
No,
a
sorry.
comment on that.
Apologies.
All right.
Yes, just a small point at the end of that. In fact, there were a couple of things I will make a comment on.
All right, Councillor Crasso, did you want to speak to this at all, having been the mover?
No.
Councillor Sanderson, go ahead.
Yes, so I had the privilege, thanks, of chairing this meeting. It was actually the first of these meetings I actually attended. A couple of points I was going to make. One of them sort of resolved itself in the way the minutes were created, and the relation, or in relation to the proposed stop control at the Alexandra Street end of Stanley Road. There was later advice given by RMS that that they couldn't use a giveaway pedestrian signs because apparently that has no legal standing. So the recommendation there has been changed to that RMS be requested to install a pedestrian warning sign on Stanley Road on approach to its intersection with Alexandra Street, which is fine.
So there's nothing wrong with that?
That's fine, but I just wanted to comment on that because there was an inconsistency with the minutes, which I had a problem with. It's been resolved. It's been resolved in a way that I'm happy with. But I just wanted to note that the fact that the recommendation is different to what was resolved at the meeting. That was the reason for it. That RMS came back with later advice about that matter.
Thank you.
Then the other point I wanted to make at 2.1 in these minutes, there was some discussion about the agendas being distributed to councillors. My personal view is that they should be.
Was that was an outcome of the meeting?
No, the point I wanted to make, there was no outcome of the meeting. It was just a discussion. So that particular point is purely...
You're going to something completely outside of this. We're dealing with the minutes, not the discussions in the meeting. You've actually gone to...
But the point I wanted to make, Mr Mayor, is that there was a discussion at that meeting. There was no resolution of that meeting.
Right. So can I put 4.9?
I might just briefly say the reason there wasn't a resolution was because there was no motion on the table.
Thanks. Yeah. All right.
Sorry
you
to
wish to
this out,
speak
Mr.
to
Mayor.
4.9?
Yes.
Councillor Miles.
Just in relation to report on 1.1, which is the Bibelina Road at Woolwich Road intersection, there's a speaker that's come into the chamber twice on that issue. is it possible to send these minutes to him or to at least get him abreast of the decision that's being made? Oh no, I am, yes, sorry.
So your question, can I pass that to the General Manager for referral? General Manager.
Sorry, that's Ferry Road, I was wrong on that one.
To the General Manager.
All good. And the other one was, and it may be better to deal with a question without notice, but I did notice that there was a couple of shop owners that weren't very happy about the 15-minute car parking times at Huntersville Village. And I knew that it came out of this committee, but it probably is too late to do anything about that unless we go back to the 15-minute car parking has been changed to 30 minutes.
To put as a question,
I think we'll do
please.
that.
Thank you, Councillor. All right, can I put 4.9, those in favour? Against? That's carried. Now, Councillor Williams, you had a comment on 4.10, 4.11, 4.12, 4.13?
Yes.
So moved, Councillor Williams, with a comment.
Well, Mr Mayor, it goes to the heart of our discussion earlier.
Secondly, Councillor Crasso. Yeah. Councillor Williams.
It goes to the heart of our earlier discussion tonight about transparency. I've always been concerned about the lack of information that comes out of our briefings, and again, there's just one-liners and the presentations that were given are lost to the benefit of people understanding our decisions. Now, some of them have subsequently come to council meetings with reports, etc. That's fine, but there are others that don't get to that level or are still in progress. And I do urge council to make the outcomes of these meetings more publicly available and more transparent for our community to be able to understand the decisions that we're making and why we're making them, because I think we're losing the opportunity in many cases where we get briefings from our staff, presentations from our staff that give us a very good insight to the reports that don't make the light of day with the community. And that helps them understand why we are making decisions and how we're making them. So again, I bring to the council's attention that I think we can do better in the way that we provide the outcomes of these briefings. And ideally, I would think the public should be able to sit in on them unless they're confidential matters.
Thank you, Councillor. So moved, seconded, all in favour, is carried. 4.14, 4.15. 4.14 is the Access Inclusion Seniors. Can we move it? Councillor Crasso, Councillor Sanderson, all in favour, that's carried. 4.15, moved Councillor Crasso, seconded Councillor Sanderson, all in favour. And I believe we've got some queries on 4.16, minutes of the Huntersville Public Art.
No.
Anybody? No, moved. Let me try again. Moved by Councillor Williams, seconded Councillor Miles, all in favour, that's carried. 4.17. Moved Councillor Collins, seconded Councillor McLaughlin. Councillor Collins.
Thank you. I just want to. I just have a question about the bottom line of how much, through you, Mr. Mayor, the General Manager, what the actual the result this year of the. I don't think it's in the report.
The cost.
Like the net result, because last year we lost quite a bit of money, and I was just wondering if it's breaking even yet, or how we're tracking to do that.
I'll come back to you with the result.
Can we get a P&L for it at the next? Would that be okay? Like a profit breakdown of it. So I know last year we lost quite. It's a great event, but sort of make sure we're supposed to be breaking even, aren't we?
Yeah, through Mr. Mayor, we'll bring the results, so what was budgeted, the revenue, and then the result.
Great, fantastic. Okay.
All right. So can I put that as in favour? Against? That's carried. So what are we left with, councillors?
What are we left with?
Nothing. That's all done. No correspondence. General business, councillors. Councillor Miles.
Mr. Mayor, 3 meetings ago, we as a council passed a resolution regarding a rural infrastructure and aid fund. I'm just wondering if there's been any, as a council, we resolved to write to metropolitan mayors to seek their support. Has that been done yet? And has that gone under your letterhead or?
I was a council right, I think, so I'm not sure where we've got with it.
Through Mr Mayor, I'll need to check.
Yeah.
Come back to you.
Yep. Would you like to do it as a question and we'll deal with it as a question?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Get some
That'd be good. Councillors, any further business? I'll declare the meeting closed 9:05. Thank you.